Fog enshrouds St. John's much of the time, almost as a stage curtain sequesters performers from their audience. It may be, then, appropriate that many townies seem to play to the gaslights, or it may simply be a tribute to the old Irish storytellers, the Sanahi, from which so many of the inhabitants of the rock have descended. Either way, stories are much of the warp and weft of the cloth of this place, and part of what has served to make it so unique. Confederation has changed this somewhat as the regional fabric has been added to the patchwork quilt of Atlantic Canada and the nation as a whole. But less than 2 generations in, the culture is still as uniquely Newfish as the dialect. There are at least 3 distinct native variants of languages from those other than the First Nations: Newfoundland English, Irish, and French, each of which lends their own linguistic color to the whole. This is a story called French Shore that's based on an old traditional folk song. So, you'd be the come from away what's been asking about the stories of folk round the bay here. Got plenty of sea yarns, some of them even mine, about what life here was like. Buy an old man a drink or two? Sure, what'll it be? Old Tom there will know. So, after settling back in, after fetching drinks, I sat and listened as Bob quickly corrected me, took a long drink, and started telling one of his stories. Me da, all the time I was growing up, what wouldn't take me out on the boat with you. As we poor Newfoundlanders fared, we were better off than most. Dad owned and skippered his own boat, and so he was off and gone to see much of the year of the ice would allow. All along both the English shore and the French there were fishing boats and little settlements. Sometimes not much more than a handful of tilts and a linear or two was sprung up for the salt to catches, and provide little respite for the crews. Dad made most of his money, not that it was ever that much, keeping those places in supplies. Weren't near to being one of the fishocracy, damn their merchant hides for all they took from them folk what needed better than they got. Sometimes he'd buy dear and sell poor, but we always managed to get by better than most. Of course, some who barely got by at all. Used to haul things for the Fishermen Trade Union Corporation, off to their stores during their heyday, primarily because they were trying to help people out too, but he'd let people pay in green cod more than they would, even if it meant losing a little here and there. Guess he figured they needed to eat, same as we did. The French sure weren't so much French anymore those days. The name went back to the old treaty times when the British and the Frenchies each had allotted fishing grounds, and the boundaries shifted from treaty to treaty. Didn't matter much to the fishing folk themselves, because the sea is the sea and there were plenty of fish for all back in those days, and the French didn't tend to settle ashore as much as the English did. Most of them, and the Irish too, ended up being called planters, not because they grew or tended crops, but given a chance to come by a piece of land, they'd find some way to plant themselves on it. The French didn't do so much of that because of how they'd cure the catch. The French had packed theirs in brine and wet cure them, so that other than provisioning fresh water and supplies, they didn't need to get too much from the land. The Brits and pretty much everyone else dry cured cod, which meant little settlements all up and down the shoreline to evaporate seawater to get the salt and flake. Those would be the drying racks. So there was something of a need for people tending those all over from Cape Bonavista up to Cape Norman and then down the western side of the Isle, even if Dad didn't go farther than Point Riche. Anyway, I'm drifting a bit. Dad's boat was a coasting schooner, and he'd take supplies into all those little towns. Just the essentials mainly, for the folk what lived down there. On account of most of them couldn't afford much more than that, and some of them not even that much. Didn't always take money from him, he tried for fish somehow, because there really wasn't much else they had. And he figured he'd do what he could to help a little before it was up to God and all to look out for him the rest of the time. Wasn't evil like the whole truck system and left out part or some recourse if they needed something mid-season. It was the summer I turned 13, maybe 14, Dad let me come along. It was probably that or apprentice me out in one of the bankers to learn cod fishing. And I guess he figured what with not having anyone else to look after keeping the boat sailing, he might as well have me learn the business. Handful of boys and men working a sailing ship will work up a powerful hunger of a day, so Dad hire a cook. Some places there's superstition about women on ships, but none of that on Dad's boat. He always had a lovely young lass along to cook. This one I remember because her name's similar to my own wife's, Mary McCormick. Mine, though, was spelled Mary in the Irish style, and her folk from down in Harbour Grace, not Bonavista. I can't remember all the names of those girls. Most of them ended up being Cookie after a couple of weeks anyway, and that was a long time ago. Wasn't until I was much older I figured out the girls weren't chosen on their culinary aptitudes, but were much more likely to be the daughter of one of his friends thought to end up most likely in a family way. Didn't make a round-heeled lass any less that way. Just got her off where she was less likely to make a spectacle of herself, where the whole town would be about gossiping about her. And she might just be settling down to raise her young and off somewhere else. Or maybe it was that she had some particular feller set on the Les Sobel, who was definitely from the wrong sort of folk, and her dad not finding him so easy to make go away and sent her off instead. I don't remember hearing anything about this particular Mary Mac, though. Some of them be saying that many a sailing man's got himself a lass in every port, but most of them, I know, weren't really that sort. They say the sea is an unforgiving mistress, and I suppose it doesn't really do anyone any harm if everyone's only up and up about it anyhow. Figure each seafarer of that kind of cloth knows that way there'll be someone who misses him, at least until her next husband comes into port on the day when the sea decides to claim him for her own. Not so much with the sailing, coasting ships, though. We were in too many places too often to arrange that sort of thing without it being all scandalous and a problem for all involved. So, as time and tide would make it, most of what fellers me aged be learning about the fairer sex was an odd mix of wonder, speculation, guesswork, and the odd bit of, shall we say, oversight, the occasional rash of pishog, and the best no one be getting up in a hobble about it or not. Anyway, I'm finally out to sea with me dad, ship's boy, deck monkey, something like that. On a little coasting schooner, lovely boat, gaff rigged fore and aft, clipper bow, there's not much room on it for someone who don't work. So out from Bonavista, it was time to learn in a hurry. Down to Amherst Cove, King's Cove, the English areas, as you can tell from the name, then Duntara and Keels, the Irish. Next day, I'd have Tickle and Plate Coves, Somerville. Can't remember the last place we put in there. Probably changed about every trip. Might have been Musgrave Town or Lethbridge. Not the one out in Alberta, mind you. Might have been down in Claude Sound, Charlottetown, or Port Blanford. Yeah, probably Claude Sound. The other two were more logging communities and fishing ones. But we put in a few of those from time to time, usually if we know someone needed a couple of spars or something, or was looking for lumber to build a new place. The routine was pretty much the same day to day, just different parts of call. Depending on the winds and how far apart they were, we'd put into 3 to 5, maybe up to a dozen outports a day. Bonavista to Cape Friels and over to Fogo and down into Gander Bay might be an exception should we start a day in one of them. Or any day when the storms were really bad, usually covered about twice as much distance as shoreline with ducking down into the coves and inlets. Can't really imagine what it was like for those folk that lived there, because nobody really went there otherwise. Dad would meet with some of the people and they'd buy what they needed or could afford, and when everyone was done, we'd be casting off and headed down to the next one unless night was falling. So we'd usually stay in port the night, tied off at the pier. Wasn't much doing any of those places short of getting in trouble or cutting a fool. But there were some girls here or there, so the fellas would be about trying to get after them. And there was always the one that came with us, who probably, as we said, had a reputation of sorts for grassing, which got her sent off with us in the first place. Even so, none of those were what you'd call trifling with their affection, but usually picked one of the lads. More than one fight broke out over it, not that it'd make any difference. So here we are, off down the French shore. Might have been Twillingate at an evening, and Cookie'd gone off with her boy. Daniel Brown, but whether he was one of old John's sons or one of Gideon's, I couldn't say. And a bunch of the others were off on their own, but I'd stayed on board. Can't remember why, but was probably tired hassling with one of the others on the crew, and being the youngest by a piece, just avoided him by staying aboard. Da was off in his cabin, probably doing accounts or something, and I took the ship's glass and climbed up to the foretop. Was just looking around to see what was there to see. Sunsets out in those ports are eye-opening, even now, with not much to distract from the view but the odd-masked fishing stages, maybe a salt box. Looking to the east, it looked as if some of the boys had smuggled aboard a bit of screech on board and were sitting watching it get dark and drinking from the hill above, and sharing with a few of the local lasses to boot. Good on them for that. Might have even been a bit of grassing going on. And there was Cookie. Right twillick I was for looking, but I'm sure, well, lass was well formed and easy to spy off the foretop. Sight for sore eyes and not a whit of shame about her. I'd probably have some what for watching, but fellers all learns about it somehow, right? Cookie and her Danny may have stayed with us to the end of the season, but weren't much longer. Ended up getting married and raising a wacky young of their own, which took after Mary. Fortunate like. I think they're still mostly around Bonavista, but some of the younger grandkids came to university and stayed. Maybe a couple of them are off in the oil sands. Since the fishing's all gone, that's happened to a lot of the folk. Time changes all by. I won't ever be like that again. A few moments after he stopped, a young man wearing a Memorial University of Newfoundland t-shirt came over to the table. Hey, Da, surprise finding you here, eh? Bob took a moment and introduced him. Me by Alan, youngest of me grandsons, lad takes after his mum and he got the smarts. He's about to be off, though, leaving us here in a day or so. Alan, I don't remember if I mentioned this to you. This year feller's collecting some of the old stories of life round the bay. It's just about telling him about growing up and going out on the boat with your great grandpa. Then mind talking with him for a spell before all your friends show? Not at all, Da. Oh, before I forget, Jenny sends to send her regards. She won't be turning out for the do tonight, so she said her goodbyes this afternoon. As far as I can tell, she doesn't like getting all maudlin with the mornings after or the long, rambling, drunken email. One or another, goodbyes suck. Can't say I blame her a bit. Wish you weren't gone off myself, but I know why you think it's the right thing to do. Might not be much to offer you around here, but you'll always know where you belong. I'll be shutting off now, back after a piece. The old man got up, leaving me in the able custody of his son. Sorry about that. Me dad's a bit of nothing to apologize for, I assured him. It's stories and personalities like him which brought me here in the first place. Yeah, still, he's a bit of an anachronism. The very stereotype of all that people laugh about when they talk in movies, some ways, you know. He means well, but, well, some days his clock stops back at Confederation, back in 49, and others you'd figure it was earlier than that, even. Whatever you do, see if you can keep him away from Confederation. It'll serve you well, because I think he's still mad at Joey Smallwood for bringing the Dominion of Newfoundland into Canada. Not sure we wouldn't have ended up here anyway in the long term, and some of the changes it brought were good for the folk here. So I've gotten one of his stories, but it sounds like there's one of yours waiting to come out. It's not so different from most of my generation here. We did well enough to make it through university, and well, jobs are still plenty scarce here. We can stay on the rock and roll the dice on finding and keeping work where the unemployment goes about 15%, or we can look elsewhere in the country and move on. You make it sound so bleak. In a lot of ways it is. 4 years at Memorial run an easy 20,000, which turns into student loans, and that's even with the province picking up a part of the tab, which aren't easy to repay when your folks don't come from money, which means you need to work someplace. Places around here which pay enough to let you live in something better than a refrigerator box on the sidewalk and repay your loans aren't too reliable, and probably worse around the bay. So we go where there's jobs. Eventually, the government will invest in infrastructure here and will stop being a have-not province. But for my generation, it's Montreal, Toronto, the tar sands in Alberta, maybe Vancouver or the States. For my brothers, it was the Athabasca and Fort McMurray. Same with 3 of my 5 cousins who have beaten a path away from here. The other 2, one's in Montreal, the other's given me a few weeks crash space in Toronto while I find a place of my own. Doesn't change who we are, where we're from, or where we belong. So we cast our leaving shadows and we'll be Canadian. Newfoundlanders in exile against our will, but even the distances can't change our own. Even the distances can't change who we are. We find our own wherever it is we end up.